Welcome to the San Francisco campus for Jewish Living. I'm thrilled to see so many familiar faces in the crowd as well as new ones. For those of you who are joining us on campus for the first time, I want to share a little bit about who we are before we begin. As the largest private, nonprofit, distinct part-skilled nursing facility in the state of California, we serve a diverse population of more than 2,000 patients and residents annually through our assisted living, short-term rehab, memory care, acute geriatric psychiatric hospital, and our long-term skilled nursing, where 96% of those we serve are Medi-Cal recipients. Since our founding in 1871, we have embraced the mission of enhancing the quality of life of older adults. Our philosophy is founded on Jewish values, including respect for elders and responsibility for the welfare of others. We place a profound emphasis on providing older adults and their loved ones with life-enriching programs and services. It is in that spirit that we welcome you here this evening, which marks the first gathering in our new speaker series, Community Conversations that Reimagine How We Age. This series, which is generously sponsored by the Julian S. Davis Lectureship Fund, has been in the works for more than 2 years, and I am so glad it is finally here. Community Conversations came out of a collective realization that the process of aging, which we are all experiencing every day, is often looked at in a way that does not leave much room for nuance. Through this series of conversations with healthcare experts, we hope to provide thought-provoking, insightful resources that all of us can integrate into our own lives. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Adrienne Green. After several years of being involved with our campus, including as a trustee, Dr. Green stepped into her current position this past summer. Prior to SFCJL, she was the Chief Medical Officer for Adult Services and Vice President for Regulatory and Medical Affairs at UCSF Health. She is board certified in internal medicine. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Green and Dr. BJ Miller. Thank you everyone so much for being here, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Stacy. I, too, am very excited to welcome you all to the San Francisco campus for Jewish Living. We look forward to this being the first of many thought-provoking and relevant community conversations. Before I introduce BJ, I would like to thank, with much gratitude, the team that put this event together. That includes Stacy and her development team, as well as many others, including our facilities team, the food services team, parking security, you name it. It took a village to pull this event together today, so thank you. And now it is my great privilege to introduce Dr. BJ Miller. Dr. Miller is a longtime hospice and palliative medicine physician and educator. He currently sees patients and families via Mettle Health, a company he co-founded to provide personalized, holistic care for any patient or caregiver needing help with the practical and existential issues that come with serious illness and disability. BJ has dedicated his career to moving healthcare forward toward a human-centered approach. He holds an undergraduate degree from Princeton, he holds a medical degree from UCSF, and he completed a fellowship in hospice and palliative medicine at Harvard. In addition to working and teaching at UCSF for more than a decade, he led the San Francisco Zen Hospice Project for 5 years. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with BJ for many years. We've collaborated in the care of individual patients, and we've worked on some bold projects. On a very personal note, in 2019, my stepmother had a tragic fall, and she experienced a large brain bleed. And my dad was really grappling with whether or not it was time to transition her into hospice. And unfortunately, a very sort of awkward and somewhat atypically, for a palliative care doctor to not have great bedside manner, came and consulted with my dad. And things didn't go very well. But after it ended and my dad processed for a little while, I knew what the right thing to do was, and that was to call BJ, which I did. And he connected with my dad, and very shortly after, my dad was very comfortable with that transition. So whether you have been able to work with BJ, whether you have read his book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, or watched his TED Talk, or this is your first time meeting him, you're in for a special treat tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. BJ Miller to San Francisco Campus for Jewish Living. All right, so BJ, we're going to start with a softball. And that is, many people don't really know what palliative care is. So can you tell us a little bit about what palliative care is and how it differs from hospice?
Yes, and Adrian, thank you. It's nice to be with you. And Stacy and everyone else, thank you for putting this together. That is not such a softball, actually. It's kind of hard to describe what the heck palliative care is, because whenever I describe it to folks, they say, well, isn't that what healthcare is? And it's sort of telling that a field like palliative care has to come along as a small subspecialty to do what many of us think healthcare should be doing by itself, which is tending to people's suffering, essentially. So palliative care is basically the interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary pursuit of quality of life and the treatment of suffering. That's basically the gist. And hospice is a subset of palliative care that is devoted to the final months or say year or so of life. It's the same training, so like Dr. Kinderman, myself, others did fellowship in this work. Studying the work of hospice and studying the work of palliative care is one and the same. It's all, you got a doctor, a nurse, social worker, chaplain, so this sort of wraparound. When the subject matter is suffering, there's no one discipline that has a lock on what that means. So there's much to share between hospice and palliative care. I think it gets a little bit more confusing that hospice is an insurance designation. So when we say hospice since the 1980s, we mean when someone goes on to hospice, you have to come off of sort of routine care. So there's a real fork in the road with hospice. First of all, someone has to say you have 6 months or less to live. And we in medicine don't often know, really, with certainty. So you have to have 6 months or less to live, and then you also have to give up curative intended treatments to get hospice. That's because it's an insurance designation. Palliative care does not have an insurance benefit per se, so it's a little bit more wide open. And you can get palliative care anytime that you're suffering more than you need to. So I don't know if I clarified that or made it more confusing. Maybe we can circle back with questions at the end, but that's the gist.
Great, thank you. So in follow-up to that question, a lot of people perceive palliative care and palliative medicine to be this sort of dark, depressing field, but it clearly brings you purpose and joy. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to palliative care and help us to understand why it can be reframed more about living than death?
Yeah, it's a true thing. A lot of us in the field have this experience very often where we tell someone what we do and usually get a head tilt and say, oh, that's so tender, or that's so sweet, or they just walk away because it freaks them out, which is not uncommon. But as a foil for a couple of things, I mean, it is filled with joyful moments and beautiful moments. That is undeniably true. And not in a ghoulish way. You certainly don't have to love death. I don't love death. But I do love life, and it turns out that life includes death. Therefore, I'm interested in death. But in terms of that joy, it's like a foil. That backdrop of suffering and when things are hard, as we all know one way or another in our lives, we've all suffered. There's something about that as a backdrop that can allow beauty and meaning and poignancy to pop. It has this urgency. It has this. You need the joy because you know what suffering is like. You know the sorrow. Therefore, you know the space of joy. They're related. It's sort of a dialectic. I don't think you can separate the two really in human experience. Put a different way, I mean, I've met a lot of people who've had just too much good luck in their lives. And it's its own kind of isolation. I remember I've asked the question of audiences that many times, like, who here hasn't suffered? And and I'll ask you guys, who here hasn't suffered? Does anyone? One person has raised their hand when I've asked that question. And it was this poor guy who came up after the talk and said, I'm so sorry I ruined your shtick there, and my parents gave me a house, and I got an education, and I can't tell you, I haven't signed. I said, sir, I'm sorry, you're suffering in front of my very eyes right now, you poor guy, because he had removed himself from life, and life includes suffering. What's the first thing you do when you come out of the womb? If you're healthy, you wail. That's our welcome to this world. It's not an easy thing being a human being, period, end of story. So one answer to the question, Adrian, is there's joy all over it because you see the necessity for joy. And the other is like you get to feel that you are working on something elemental. It's like the least esoteric thing in the world, as we've just sort of proven. We all belong to this club. It is the most inclusive club I know of. And for all that, it feels really good to be working on it. If I were just trying to spend all my time in things that just made me smile, I'd get boring, and I'd also feel kind of removed from life. So anyway, that's the sort of gist. And for me, that came, the sort of personal awareness came from my own experience losing some limbs, and that happened in college when I was 19. Electrical burns, screwing around on a train, and that brought me close to death, and that welcomed me to the ranks of the disabled, and that taught me many, many things, including how much we need each other, and how much kindness can just really, like someone can make my day with a little holding open the door. It doesn't take much, it's not exotic. But these sort of little nods to each other make such a difference. And not just a nicety like bedside manner, it's sort of nice if you have it, but in something more essential. When I was near death, there were times where I wasn't really, making a case for life was kind of hard with all that pain. But then someone would do something sweet. Someone would hold eye contact, someone would dare to touch my funky body, and that was all I needed. It was like life hangs by a thread in both directions. A simple, kind act, a simple piece of beauty, that can make all the difference. That can be reason to live. And so I get to see that, and I get to feel that, and I get to feel part of this big reality without blinders on, real reality, full reality, not just the parts that's fun, but the whole shooting match. And that feels really good.
I think that's brought you a very, very unique perspective. And the next question is actually about something you call perspective making. And we titled this presentation with the word perspective in it. And perspective can play a powerful role in making sense of life, loss, grief, death. Can you expand on what you've referred to as perspective making and offer your suggestions about how perspective can be harnessed during life's more challenging moments? And I think you've alluded to that a little bit, but maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I love this subject. I mean, this is why when I went back after my injuries, I kind of on a hunch, I changed my studies to art history. And I hadn't ever studied art history. It was a weird hunch. And it was a good one, because at the time, what I was thinking about lying in that bed was, questions of identity, like who am I now? And what is this all about? And what's my place? Who am I, and what is this world, and who am I in this world? This was the stuff that was in my mind at the time. And it felt like, humans, what do humans do? Well, they do weird things, like they make art. Why do we make art? And so that question really lit up for me. It's just people creating from their experiences, taking the raw material of their life and making something of it. All the more poignant if it has no purpose except for its own sake. This creation that is not a utilitarian object, but is something strictly for our admiration. That seems really wild to me at the time. And so on a hunch, I went back and rejoined school and studied art history. And that's where I really learned. The hunch really paid off, because I learned how to see. And there was a lot, when I looked down on my body, there was a lot I would love to have changed, but I couldn't. But I did get hip to this thing that we can change how we see the world. And in that way, we can change the world. You know, for example, am I a lucky person? I get to sit here on this stage with you guys. I've got this one arm. I was right-handed. I survived something that I might not have otherwise. So am I very lucky, or am I extremely unlucky? The answer is both. The answer is yes. And it just depends how I frame it. You know, we're all on this one planet together. In some real way, we are all one, right? Or you can zoom out and look at our planet among a zillion others and say, well, we're one of a zillion. Or you can zoom in on any one of us and see that we're each hosting trillions of organisms ourselves. We're universes on our own rights. Those are all true statements. It just depends how you see it. And I got sort of hip to this idea. It's almost like photographers in the group, you'll know what I mean with the zoom lens. You can zoom in, you can zoom out. And it changes just about everything that you're looking at. And we as human beings, we innately possess this talent, this skill. I'm not sure that any other animals do. Don't know that. But it's a real talent that we humans have. And I think we need to name it so that we can use it wisely. The power that we have, the control, if we need to go there, would be that we get to choose the frame. We get to zoom in if we need to. We get to zoom out if we need to. Zoom in on my feelings to give them their space and their time and make sure they're real and not talk myself out of having them too quickly. And then zoom out and see them as variations on themes that we all experience. You know, in this way, there's sort of a diastole and systole with our point of view, and you can play with that. That is in our power. So that I have found to be the most useful tool in my life, and anything that I've ever worked with patients has been the most powerful medicine I've ever seen in action, and it's always accessible. So that's what I mean by perspective making, and I think that is, well, I've already said that's something of my church.
I love that. So this, as Stacy shared earlier, is a pretty wonderful senior living community. And so I'm going to ask you to help us provide some practical advice for the audience. There's no how-to manual for aging, particularly with respect to the important conversations that loved ones should be having with each other. Could you provide some practical advice about how we speak with loved ones about what matters as we age?
Yeah, you know, I think one note here is, and we've kind of been doing this along the way, Adrienne, which is to sort of normalize this subject by just talking about it, by living it ourselves, being the point. So I think part of the answer is you set the stage, the environment, you make it easy for yourself and others to have feelings, even if they're unsavory ones, to share thoughts, even if they're frightful ones. Just make a nice, big, wide stage. Give each other, give yourself wide berth. So that's a big answer to the question versus something more sort of tactical and ask this question, don't ask that question, because you know we're an interesting species. We have this individuality. We also have these cultural overlays, and what might be right for one person might be exactly the wrong thing to say to another. So it defies scripting, but I do think you can set a tone. You can make it okay to feel and think just about anything. And beyond that, I think it can be really useful to personalize it. So you might say to a loved one who may be reluctant to talk about it for whatever reason, their own aging, their own health, you can talk about your aging, your own ideas of aging, how you're feeling. You can talk about your health, what you might want towards the end of your life. You might reference, Uncle Sal, you know, or someone in your experience. Say, I remember when Uncle Sal was getting older and he never wanted to go back to the hospital, remember, and he elected hospice and got to be home, or, you know, whatever it is. Just share existing stories so we have something to bounce off of. Otherwise, the subject gets really abstract. You know, a blank sheet of paper is not a very functional way to start. So sharing your own experience can be a really powerful way in. There's also, I've noticed sometimes for folks, there can be a real reluctance to talk about their own experience with death or aging. They may not want to for a number of reasons, and they may resist the idea of, say, of doing an advance directive. We should talk about that for a second too, but there's a lot of leverage with some folks to say, you know, the advance directive, it's not really, it's not for you so much, it's one of the kindest things you can do for your family. So sometimes there's leverage to say something like that because, gosh, Mary, would you, when it's your time, the truth is healthcare can keep a body going for a long time. Is that what you want? And if you don't state your wishes, then that's on your family to say, and it can be really agonizing for the family to have to guess what you want. So sometimes making the appeal, not for their own sense or their own sake directly, but on behalf of their children, that's often a very powerful way to go. So again, no right or wrong thing, but another thing to state here is have these conversations over time, both to normalize them and allow each other to change your mind. Like, as I sit here at age 52, relatively healthy, I may feel one way about going to the hospital or CPR or being on a breathing machine or whatever else. If you ask me again in 10 years, I might feel differently. If you ask me again after a diagnosis might affect my odds of surviving that, et cetera, then I might feel differently again. So give each other the dignity of change, of the ability to change your mind. That's really, really key. And I'll say one more thing, Adrian, we referenced it, but a living will or an advance directive is a really important tool. There's a cousin of that tool called the POLST, Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment, and something we can talk more about. But just to say, these can be very, very useful pieces of paperwork to have handy, but they're also conversation starters. They'll ask you questions by going through that process that will elicit feelings and opinions. And I will say one more thing about the advance directive. A lot of people wonder, why do I have to, why do I have to state my wishes? Look, my doctor knows me, I like my doctor, he'll know what to do, or she'll know what to do. No, they probably don't know what you would want, and even if they did at some point, they've got 8 zillion patients to care for, and the way medicine has gone, the Marcus Welby notion is just dead. I'm sorry, it is not really possible anymore. So watch yourself. If you say, I don't need to fill out that paperwork, I'll be fine, all right, The thing to understand about, one of the things to understand about healthcare, with good intentions, it's got defaults. So if you don't state your wishes, it will default to more intensive, more aggressive care. And we have the technology now to prop a body up for practically indefinitely. So if you don't want that, you actively have to say no to that. And you can do that with paperwork, or you can do that in person. But this idea that there's a benevolent system that will just swoop you up and carry you through to the end that you'd ever wish for yourself, please don't. Yeah.
This is actually the perfect time to say that on November 28th, our second speaker in this speaker series is Dr. Rebecca Sidori, who is a geriatrician who basically has built her career around the advance directive. So hopefully we'll see you all back here then for part 2 of this part of the conversation. She's got some really incredible perspectives and tools for the advance directive.
Yeah, amen. She's great, and this is not an easy conversation. It's a good one to have with somebody. I would really recommend you show up for that, yeah.
So BJ, you've provided care in a number of different places and different types of environments, and you now have a new company called Mettle Health. And I've heard that it doesn't replicate sort of the classic model of care, and you're really looking to address some gaps in the healthcare system. Could you tell us a little bit about Mettle Health, how it works, and we've also heard that you're launching something called the Mettle Method. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you. So Mettle, we may need to change our name because I always have to explain it. It's M-E-T-T-L-E, like your inner strength. That's the name, Mettle Health. We like that. That's kind of what we're going for, not to teach our clients new things, but rather to kind of evince their inner strength, who they are. So that's the name, Mettle Health, mettlehealth.com. It was born in the pandemic. We kind of quickly hung our shingle to be accessible. But we also, to your point, Adrian, we pulled it out of the medical model. I am a physician, but I'm no longer really practicing medicine, actually. And that's for a number of reasons. We can talk about it at whatever length you like. I have a fair amount of, I have a sturdy list of criticisms for our healthcare system. I also love our healthcare system, but I have found my own practice of medicine ground me down in ways that weren't helpful to me or my patients. And I found myself increasingly the stuff of just the prescription pad. And I was increasingly aware that all the existential and spiritual and social, all the other stuff that doesn't make its way or to the doctor visit was where my interests were. And that's where I've only been interested in the prescription pad as an excuse to be in front of people to talk about those other things. So the pandemic allowed me to say, let's let go of the medical piece. It's much easier to get started. And let's just focus on the stuff we really believe in and really care about. And this way too, so if you were our client at Mettle, we're not your doctor. We're this objective-ish third party that can be your coach, can be your cheerleader, can be your advocate. And people come to us as a sort of a safe place to fall apart. And it's a safe place to talk about just about anything. And we have loved this model. It's an hour at a time. It feels relatively generous that way. So that is what Mettle Health does first and foremost, is these sort of counseling sessions. And we can help you, navigate healthcare, but also leave healthcare behind when you're ready. So that's what we do. Most of our clients are caregivers. That was the other thing. By pulling out of the medical model, that meant you didn't have to prove you were sick to come talk to us. You didn't have to be the patient to come talk to us. Anyone can come talk to us, which has been really beautiful to depathologize these very normal states. Being sick is normal. Dying is normal. The medical model, for a number of reasons, pathologizes you for these normal things. And you can feel that. And so we also wanted to free ourselves up from the language and the structures of healthcare. So anyway, that's what we're doing. There are also free webinars and stuff that we just make it possible and accessible. So check us out, please, as you like. And then the Mettle method, Adrian, I don't know how I feel about that phrase. We might scrap that too. It feels a little haughty or something. I don't know. It's not like we have secrets of the universe. But the Mettle method is essentially what we learned from Rachel Naomi Remen, whom some of you guys might know of. She was is a mentor to me. And she, there's this conversation that, patient-centered care is sort of a novel phrase. What else would it ever have been? Do we really need to name patients? What the heck was it ever focused on? The answer is it's really been focused on your disease. You can feel this oftentimes in the medical model, that you, as such, your personality, your idiosyncrasies, those can sometimes be in the way. You are there to have your illness treated. And there's power to that, but there's also a lot that can get left out. And so a lot of us went from trying to sort of work in a disease-centric model, but sort of call attention to the patient and say, pull towards a patient-centric model. And then some of us, like you referenced, Adrian, we'd say, well, there's a human-centric thing in here. Never mind being a patient. It's just about being a human being. And then further still, from Rachel, I got this notion that, it's not the doctor or the patient vying for primacy or the disease. It's about the relationship. It's about the dynamic between people. That's where the therapy is. A lot of healing happens in relationship, not thanks to a drug. And that's a really important thing to name. And there's ideas about self-care within medicine. You have to name self-care as though it would otherwise not be important. And that's also telling. But the truth is, both parties in a dynamic need to be participating and need their needs met on some level. And if you tend to the relationship between two people, then we have found that that's where a lot of therapy actually plays out very nicely. And we don't have to make the decision who's more important, the patient or the clinician. So back to this Mettle method, it's basically us trying to take a stab at teaching this relationship-centric care. And it's meant to push back on burnout and evince resiliency and things like that. But it's essentially just that, focusing on the dynamic between people, the relationship you have with yourself, with your family, etc. So that's what that is.
Just quickly in follow-up, I get a fair number of questions here about care coordination and how care gets coordinated with a primary care physician or an oncologist or whoever else someone might be seeing. Do you at Mettle coordinate with the rest of the healthcare team?
We do informally, and it's something we want to develop more formally. So we started in the Bay Area. We have clients all over the country, in fact, some all over the world. But the system, we know, a lot of us are from the Bay Area, and we find ourselves having relationships with people. You know, I see Dr. Jahan here, I see Dr. Kinderman here, I see others that I've known over the years, and we know these relationships are really key. And the communication is really, really key, and can happen when you have a life in the place you're serving. So we have been doing this sort of informally, and like I say, as we grow, if we can get ourselves to grow, we'd love to have sort of regional centers where we can get to know the services on the ground. One of the things I love about our model is doesn't compete with anybody. We're not competing with the clinicians. We're not becoming the clinicians. And so we don't really have a natural enemy. There's no need for a turf war. We're in a very well positioned to give good advice, I think, but also to coordinate with people around someone's care. So, yes, this is something we do and we want to do more of.
Yeah, it seems like just an amazing way to augment care, really for the whole ecosystem and family.
For everybody involved, yes.
I love that. So I want to talk about your book now. So there's several quotes and concepts in A Beginner's Guide to the End that really resonated with me. And there's one quote that seems sort of the essence of what the book is all about, and that is, "Our ultimate purpose here isn't so much to help you die as it is to free up as much life as possible until you do." And then relatedly, in another chapter, you talk about stocking up on joy, which I really love that concept. So here on our campus, we have many programs, I think, that really seek to help our residents stock up on joy as they age. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on this sort of reframing of end of life that could allow one to live more fully.
Yeah, it's a big one. One thing is just to point out, I use the phrase end of life too, but I mean, one way is to sort of try to find a way to being interested in the subject. If I can be fascinated by my life, I'm much more likely to live it. So similarly with mortality, if we can find our way to being interested in it. So end of life, it's kind of it's an importantly a misnomer. Life will go on. This life, BJ, I will die. And life will go on. Both of the sides of that coin, I think, are really, really key. So one is, again, to try to get in the ballpark. What is this thing what we're talking about? What is this death thing? Well, I don't really know what death is, but I know it's part of life. So I know this is a huge distinction, guys. It'll sound kind of maybe obvious, but to say that death is part of life is a liberating statement, that we are born with the seeds of our own demise. It's not as though if you play all your cards right and don't smoke and eat a lot of broccoli, you're here forever. That's not the math. That's not how it works. Death is part of the deal. You can't get one without the other. And I hammer that point home so we don't accidentally fall into the trap that thinking that death is A, avoidable, B, a punishment, or C, that there's this foreign invader coming to get us. No, it's not that. It is in us. It is part of the deal. It's part of the admission fee for getting to be on the planet. So again, we're back to kind of normalizing it and making space for it so you can have thoughts and feelings flow. I think that's really, really key. And then beyond that, I think, you can, it's like we were talking about perspective making. I think you have to zoom in and zoom out. So yeah, zoom out to kind of find your perspective. Death is part of the deal. Great, okay. But then zoom in too. If I just stop the sentence there, then it would be like, well, why are you crying? Everyone dies, That's a pretty harsh thing to say to somebody and pretty insensitive. And the truth is, how we die, when we die, who's around, These all affect the experience of dying. You know, we are aware that we're living in a world right now that's it's a tough place. And we're aware of senseless deaths happening all over the place. And would we say, well, that's life, it just comes and goes, easy, you know. No, how we die matters. And I find a lot of traction distinguishing between unnecessary suffering and the stuff you can't avoid. Life, like we've suggested, includes hardship, whoever you are. That begs acceptance, you know? That's the necessary suffering. The unnecessary suffering from cruelty to ourselves or to others, or just not paying attention, willful inattention, willful ignorance, these are sources of suffering that are unnecessary. And that begs a sort of advocacy. So yes, even as we make space for the realities of death, I don't want to be glib about it and just usher it in unnecessarily either. There's a quote from Rilke that I try to live by, and I kind of referenced it earlier, but it's something like, he wrote a letter to a countess somebody or other, and it's something that's like, I'm not suggesting that you love death, but rather that you love life so fully without picking and choosing that you automatically fold death into life's other half into life. And I love that notion. And if you can bridge love and death, then you really got something here. And I think that's really a beautiful notion. It's not like, I love life when it's really kind to me, or I love life if I get to live another year, or I love life if this or that thing happens, but I don't love it otherwise. You know, we've all had the experience of someone who ostensibly loves us, maybe, but not the full enchilada. It's sort of strategic. They love us if we do certain things. The love I'm talking about is way bigger, way harder. And if we can kind of cast that vibe, that does not exclude any of life to love it, then I think we've got something. And it's in that space I think we can work. So I think I may have strayed from your question a little bit, Adrian, but maybe I'll shut up.
That's okay, because you teed up my next question perfectly. So it works quite well. So you were talking a little bit about things being tough right now. And things have been tough in our community as well. And we have a lot of our community members here today, both residents and staff. And in the last month, we've had, in our assisted living community, many deaths. And while, you know, many were they were anticipated, it still weighs really heavily on the community. And this is a place where that is going to continue to happen. And so I'm wondering if you could provide some recommendations about how we think about that as a community. What are some of the things that we can do to celebrate our residents before they die, after they die? What recommendations do you have for us?
Yeah, well, I think one big thing, so I'm biased, obviously, from our line of work, but it's a fun thought. If we could do one thing in this modern day, if humans could take on one, what would be the single thing to kind of help right the ship or help us along? And I think, for my money, that one thing would be grieving. We get really good at grief. I don't mean to suggest it's an accomplishment to grieve well, or it's a skill that you have to go master. I don't know that anyone masters grief. It's not a right way or a wrong way to do it, but giving it its due. I inherited this sort of notion, this very American notion that if you're strong, well, then you have a loss and you get right back up again. Get right back on the horse, keep going. And, you know, on some level, there's some power to that. But what I had to do that was just to lop off so many of my own thoughts and feelings. And I basically alienated myself from my own reality, which was not very therapeutic. It maybe helped me get out of bed for a few days, but I shortchanged grief, and I thought that's what I should do, and I was rewarded for that. I was applauded. That looked like strength to some people. And it really was not. It was actually through working with patients who showed me what grief was about. and let themselves linger with those feelings, didn't try to talk themselves out of that sadness, saw it as part of their love for that person, that's when I got I tuned in and in a different way to my own experience. And I started welcoming grief rather than trying to push it away. And all sorts of things opened up for me. It's like I got reacquainted with myself. And I lost my sister a long time ago. And by letting myself, years in delay, letting myself finally grieve, I could think about her again. She had become hidden, and her memory was like in a black box. I couldn't even access it because I had walled it off. It was too painful, ostensibly. But when I opened that chest again and let myself feel the feelings, oh, I got to have a relationship with her again. It was kind of magical. So I don't mean to go on about that so much, but except to say, Adrienne, I think one big answer to the question is, especially a place like this, we should really, grief should be part of our daily habit. I don't know that it ends, but these days when we can be aware of so much suffering besides our own, whether it's our neighbors or people we live with around here or across the world through social media, whatever it is, my sense is we're all, if we're paying attention, we're probably all in some amount of grief all the time. So that's why I say this is, if we see that as a skill to embrace, it's a way of embracing love and embracing the human experience and normalizing a fuller reality. So I think a place like the Jewish home should be just a beacon for grief. And I don't mean that to say we just walk around and mope all day long. But, grief doesn't disinclude laughter and joy. It's it's a testament to the whole, to the totality of the experience. And you happen to be sitting on, cultural traditions around grief are really important. You have rituals at the ready, thanks to the Jewish origin of this place. So reawakening or rekindling those old traditions, ritual is a really beautiful, powerful way to go. The hard part is a lot of us have been cut off from ritual. And one of the reasons why ritual is so powerful is you don't have to think. There's a pathway for you. Oh, I'm in grief now. Not as much as expected of me. I'm in an altered state, and that's okay. My community is acknowledging that's okay. And ritualizing that shortchanges the intellect. You don't have to think through every step. You've got a pathway. And it also tells you that whatever you're going through now has been the way of the world for a long time. So you key into history and tradition, and you feel part of something that otherwise, and this loss can make you feel so cut off. Ritual can do the opposite. So I think you're sitting on both the excuse and the mindset here to embrace grief, to rekindle rituals and perhaps create new ones. It can be a really creative way to respond to loss. So yeah, and maybe that's a daily acknowledgement and lighting a candle, or maybe when you walk in the threshold of this building or out of the threshold, you pause for a moment, have a moment of silence or something. You just note the difference. I think a lot of us will also, when it comes time, if we live in a setting that does this, that honors that loss, it'd be beautiful to see the knock-on effects of I see other people being celebrated even after they're gone. Well, you can imagine I'll be less afraid to leave. I will know that I'm not going to be forgotten so easily. So it's in some ways that simple and that difficult. The difficulty means we just have to sort of accept that this is part of the deal and quit our war with death. Yeah.
Great. Well, before we turn to our audience for some questions, I have one more question that's along the more practical side. And I think it follows nicely the discussion about grief. And in addition to having a lot of our residents here this evening, we also have a lot of their caregivers. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about self-care, because being a caregiver, whether professionally or personally, it can be really overwhelming, and self-care is incredibly important. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your thoughts on self-care.
Yeah, well, like I referenced earlier, it's funny to me that that's like naming patient-centered care. We have to name self-care to make sure we acknowledge that it's a thing. The culture, as we all know, well, maybe many of us know, in medicine and caregiving in general, I often hear caregivers say, well, they're just not allowed to acknowledge their own pain because they're not the patient. The one who's really suffering is the patient. I'm just a caregiver. All the myriad ways we talk ourselves out of caring for ourselves. One way or another, we just have to find our way to embracing the notion that we too are human beings with needs and wants ourselves. That is no favor. I think old school way, if you really wanted to show in medicine that you really cared, you don't go to sleep, you don't have a family, you don't have any other interests, you don't leave the hospital. And I think we've learned by now that that's a way to become a really scarred down, prickly doctor that no one wants to be around, who doesn't deliver much healing care. So one of the things is to disabuse ourselves of this notion that if we really care, then we're just in service to others. The service to others is a very real way to care for ourselves. That is true. But there's something different. The self-abdication that I know that I have worked hard to find my way out of. I used to see the zero sum. If I really cared about others, that meant I cared less about myself. That math is just, I think we can say, is debunked. It doesn't work. That's not right. That's why we have so much burnout, et cetera. So I'm going to this length to just sort of justify. We have to justify that as caregivers, professional or otherwise, our needs matter. And that's the wisdom of Rachel's relationship-centered care. It's the dynamic between two people. And if you're burned out and scarred down and haven't eaten, haven't been outside, have no sense of why it's powerful and amazing to be alive in the first place, well, then it's pretty hard to be an agent on behalf of life. So get beyond the notions of selfish and selfless and explore the space where those words kind of lose meaning, that space between us. So for me, self-care, it's a work in progress, I will say. I teeter on burnout and all sorts. I have got a long way, lots to learn. But for one is I try to take my own medicine and talk like this to myself in the mirror too. And I try to remind myself, I catch myself, the self-abdication thing is a real habit for a lot of us. And that's not doing anyone any service. If someone loves me, cares for me, even if I'm charged with caring for them. Like I grew up with a mom who had polio and post-polio syndrome, and by some measure, I've been a caregiver my whole life. I've not used that word. But if I, in the name of my mom's care, was, withholding love from myself, not allowing myself to be interested in my own life, she would smack me. That would not serve her at all. That would hurt her feelings. So anyway, obviously I need to justify this self-care thing myself, and I do. And a lot of it for me is I'm sort of literal. So if I'm around sort of end of life a lot, I like to go outside and be around plants bounding out of Mount Tam, or the natural world for me is where so much is at. That's where so many of the answers are. I'm trying to reacquaint myself with being a natural animal as well. So for me, getting outside into the woods is a huge part of my self-care, and otherwise getting into the museums. Yeah, and eating really yummy food.
Back to art history, and it's good to be in the Bay Area. There's no shortage of good food. Well, thank you, BJ, so much for your thoughtful responses to my questions. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and perspective and experience with us this evening. If anybody is interested in BJ's book, they are for sale over near where you came in. I want to just remind everybody, as I mentioned before, on November 29th, I think I said 28th before, on November 29th, we'll have Dr. Rebecca Sidori here to talk about advanced care planning. And then on January 28th, Dr. Louise Aronson, who's written the Pulitzer-nominated book, Elderhood, will be here to speak with us. So we have a great lineup. We hope that you will join us again in the future, and really appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday to be here with us today, and look forward to seeing you back here again. Thank you.